business model?
I think it's worth repeating. Startup is a temporary organization in search of repeatable and scalable business model. It's worth thinking about also. Another important component of the lean startup is the pivot.
Yes.
When do you decide to pivot? I think that most of the entrepreneurs I know have this emotional attachment to their idea, to their product. How could they possibly let go? Maybe they're leaving a diamond in the rough, or maybe it is the right time to move. How do they know it's time to pivot?
So first, let's define what a pivot is, right? And so, a good number of entrepreneurs, particularly founding CEOs, think a pivot is simply, I changed my mind. That's not a valid definition of a pivot. It might explain entrepreneurs with attention deficit disorder, but it really isn't a good definition. My definition of a pivot is a substantive change to one or more of the business model components. Again, that seems fancy and complicated, but if you really think about it, a pivot says, I've gotten out of the building and discovered that my customers aren't, men 28 to 35 in Istanbul. My customers might actually be, broader in the whole Middle Eastern region. That's a pretty big insight, and therefore you'll pivot who your customer segment is. Or you might decide that your revenue model, it's not freemium. Oh my gosh, we figured out we can actually charge for the product. That's a substantive pivot. And so you have found something specifically about a part of the business model that you need to change. The other piece about the pivot, by the way, is that what we kind of enforce is you can't just go out and say, here's what I heard yesterday, and change the whole company. In fact, I have a 72-hour hold on any pivots for founders. You're not allowed to go from your brain to your mouth for 72 hours, or else you jerk your company around in a very bad way.
That's sleeping over the idea.
You have to sleep on it for 3 days. Talk to your board, talk to some advisors, talk to some mentors, but ultimately you really need to think about whether you want to pivot, because these are real changes to either engineering or sales or whatever. The pivot, though, does something else, and it's not intuitively obvious. In the old days, 20th century, and maybe some of you are still practicing this, is what we used to do is write a business plan. A very nice document. It was a business plan is defined in the 21st century as the document that your investors made you write that they never read. You're supposed to laugh here. This is...
It's a different sense of humor in this country.
Right, yeah. Maybe we're still writing business plans. And by the way, the best part of the business plan was a 5-year plan, a forecast in the back, which forecasted essentially, if you think about it for a startup, a series of unknowns. Now, what's interesting is a business plan makes all the sense in the world in a large company when you have a series of knowns. I know my customers, I know my channel, here's my next product. I could write a business plan. The mistake we made was taking that same document and trying to apply it for a series of unknowns. Now, I have to remind you, the only people who had 5-year plans with a series of unknowns who required 5-year plans that way were venture capitalists in the Soviet Union. And we know how well they turned out for at least one of those groups. And I'm not suggesting we don't need planning. I am suggesting that the process ended up doing some absurd things. Here's what happened. When you would write a business plan and you'd get money from an investor, they would look at that 5-year forecast, and then you would have board meetings. And in Silicon Valley, we'd have board meetings every 6 weeks, and they'd ask you, how are you doing per plan?
Compare.
And you were supposed to execute that plan. It didn't matter that you were getting new data from customers that said the plan was obsolete. The board funded that plan. You would ship the product, and you'd have a launch party. Everybody would be happy. And then a couple months later, people would be asking the VP of sales, how are we doing per plan? And the VP of sales would always say, great pipeline. Now, for those of you who've never done that, great pipeline means we really don't have any sales, and it's going to come, but don't worry. And this would repeat multiple board meetings until one day the board would fire and the CEO would fire the VP of sales.
That's a pivot, isn't it?
Why? We're not executing the plan. And so we would continue, a new VP of sales would say, well, that was a stupid plan. Here's the new plan. By the way, when they said, here's a new plan, we were actually doing a pivot. And this would continue for another 6 months, and if it still wasn't working, we'd fire the VP of marketing. Why? Because it can't be the VP of sales' problem, it's VP of marketing. And the new VP of marketing would come in and say, well, here's the new positioning. We just did another pivot. And then finally, if we're still not making money or not meeting our plan, we fire the CEO. Now, if you think about this, the one thing we never fired was the plan. It's a big idea. The one thing we never said is perhaps our initial assumptions were incorrect. Yet we now know, after doing startups for 30 or 40 years, it's the very rare startup that gets the initial assumptions correct. And therefore, the business model canvas and the lean methodology says, hey, those are the things we're changing first. We fire the plan first before we fire the people. That's a big idea. And that's why this whole lean methodology makes people from large companies incredibly uncomfortable. In fact, it's why large company executives, and sometimes why government officials who need certainty, have a hard time understanding the uncertain nature of early stage ventures. By definition, they're unstable and unknowns. We're solving for multiple unknowns.
This is actually a good point to dive into